Hello from COP28 in Dubai. I want to welcome our guests here in the audience who've traveled to COP and who are local as well as everyone watching online. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Randy Bell. I'm a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, as well as an associate partner at Denton's Global Advisors. It is my distinct pleasure to be moderating this session called Laying Net Zero's Groundwork, Energy Corridors of the Future. Today we are at the Global Decarbonization Accelerator Pavilion, which is being run by the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. Thank you to COP28 Energy Transition Team and the Atlantic Council for hosting us. Our discussion is being live streamed and published on the Atlantic Council webpage. Please visit atlanticcouncil.org for more details about GDA Connect and the agenda for the rest of the COP. So today we're going to be discussing energy networks, the wires and pipelines and railways and ships that deliver energy from where it is produced to where it is consumed. Well, there are some very interesting ideas to move production much closer to the consumer. That's not always feasible, nor is it always the most efficient solution. Grids and pipelines are going to need to expand to deliver clean electricity, hydrogen, transport carbon dioxide from point of capture to storage facility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then there are the inputs to clean energy products such as critical minerals, concrete, advanced materials that are necessary for a range of energy technologies. So to discuss all of these issues and answer the questions, are infrastructure requirements overlooked in the energy transition planning? How can roadblocks such as permitting delays be navigated to facilitate clean energy infrastructure deployment? And how do energy and supply chain concerns impact government and corporate choices for clean energy and energy deployment? So to discuss these, we have a fantastic group of speakers today. We have Miranda Ballantyne, Strategic Advisor and Founding CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Association. We have Beata, I'm already going to get your name wrong, I'm sorry, we were practicing beforehand, Dashenska Mujiska, pretty good, close enough, President of the Management Board of the BGP Bank, Polish Development Bank. We've got Rachmat Kaimudin, the Deputy Coordinating Minister of Maritime Affairs and Investments in Infrastructure and Transportation from the Republic of Indonesia. We have Helena Matza, the Acting Special Coordinator in the Office of the U.S. Special Coordinator for the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment at the U.S. Department of State. And we have Rebecca Sedler, the Senior Vice President of Interconnectors at National Grid. So a really remarkable panel. Remember, this is all on the record, so we will go from there. I want to start off with Deputy Minister Kamudin and talk about JETP, because that's really a remarkable initiative for Indonesia that is a great partnership, but you're coming to finalize it. So I'd love to just hear the status of that and how you're thinking about infrastructure as part of that.
Yeah, thank you, Randolph. Glad to be here. So basically, in the 21st of November, we have launched what they call the Comprehensive Investment Plan and Policy for Just Energy Transition Partnership. So JETP is an Indonesian and IPG, G7, Denmark and Norway initiative, which basically want to help Indonesia to reach net zero in power sector by 2050. And basically, we have created the plan. There's a lot of potential investments in the plan. We will upgrade our long-term power plan based on those studies. So basically, for us, of course, because we are a developing country, we would like to improve our power sector, but also to decouple it through emission, right? So I think we are very excited with this progress, and hopefully, later on we can discuss much more about that.
That sounds great. Now I want to go to Helena, since I know you care about this and are working on this as well. So I'd love to hear about it from the U.S. perspective.
Sure. So I think Rahma did a very good job in describing what the JETP looks like in its application with Indonesia. Part of the idea here is to make sure that we're taking a multifaceted approach, both with JETPs, working with multiple donors, in doing everything we can to bring accelerated finance to help work to actually decarbonize power sectors and energy systems at large. In the case of Indonesia, I think we've made a lot of progress. Of course, what's special about these are they're country-led. So in the case of Indonesia, they're developing their master plan. They made their carbon emissions target, and then we're working together to bring the appropriate public and private capital to help actually move that along. And as we discover and learn issues along the way, how do we go find other solutions for other parts of the energy system, for off-grid power solutions? And that's where some of the work that I do with the Partnership of Global Infrastructure and Investment comes in, to help bridge some of that additional infrastructure investment that we need to see in the power sector and in heavy emitting sectors, and really important ones, like in the case of Indonesia, in the nickel production sector as well.
So Helena, maybe we started off pretty narrow with Indonesia, but maybe we can broaden it a little bit just to talk about how you and PGI think about economic corridors more generally, particularly on electricity interconnection, because I know we have a number of folks working on electricity connection here.
Great, happy to do so. So for those of you who are not familiar with PGI, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, this is a G7 combined effort where together we're deploying $600 billion to close the infrastructure gap in emerging economies around the world. We're deploying those dollars together over a 5-year period through 27. The U.S. contribution's around $200 billion. So that's just kind of an overview. And the way that our President Biden, has tasked us to think about our contributions to PGI is to not just think about how we aggregate projects across our sectors, which energy is a huge piece, but we do digital, we do critical physical infrastructure like ports and rail, and we also do ag, healthcare, and other really important elements that are really part of the ecosystem of how you think about economic development. And so our president tasked us with how do we think about that all together? And when we moved forward, he announced just at the G7 Hiroshima, I guess less than a year ago, time continues to fly, our flagship initiative, which is Libido Corridor. So this is a large-scale project that we're doing from the port of Libido in Angola with a rail refurbishment, another rail line, a lot of solar deployment, connecting DRC and Zambia, as well as encapsulating the copper cobalt belt to be able to not only help monetize those resources for those countries, but also try to incentivize additional investment in agriculture. So how does this tie to electricity? One of the biggest things we're working on in Angola right now is a really large-scale solar project. It's been announced and celebrated many times across the COP here. We'll be moving forward, we believe, with a second deployment related to microgrids. But when President Lorenzo was in the U.S. visiting President Biden just a few days ago, and we sat down with President Lorenzo ahead of his meeting, the first thing he said is, look, there's this huge amount of investment in our solar capacity. We're going to be over capacity soon. Our neighbors in Namibia and DRC and in parts of Zambia don't have the same production capacity. They don't have the same capabilities. They don't have the hydro resources that they have also been able to develop. You need to help us connect to this infrastructure you're already investing in, your transportation corridor, a new transmission line going from a kind of central Angolan hydropower station, hydropower project, to connect to already this corridor, and then through some of these other potential avenues, whether it's to Namibia or Zambia. This is very fresh. He just mentioned it a few days ago. But I share this as an example of how we look at these opportunities. If we are investing multiple years in one country, a handful of countries, we're connecting areas that wouldn't have otherwise been connected, whether that's through rail, whether that's through road, whether that's opening a port expansion. That is the ideal opportunity to think about how we support their electricity system at the same time. And when we do that together, we're actually able to get more exciting projects done.
Thank you, Helena. That's really, really amazing and quite a tremendous amount of work. I want to pivot now to Poland and Eastern Europe and think about European energy networks and the challenges that you're facing, particularly in Eastern Europe. Beata, what are you seeing, and what is Poland's approach to this?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me here today. Yeah, we are the witnesses of the multi-crisis that we are facing right now, and especially the energy. It is the most important part of this crisis. And in European Union, and especially in the Central Eastern part of Europe, we have a double challenge, to be honest, because we have to transform our energy system. The big challenge with the coal, of course, and how to reduce and how to transform our energy sources into the renewable sources. And of course, we are thinking how to build the mix of these sources, including the nuclear energy, because the rising consumption of energy across the Europe, we have very industrial part of our countries. So we have to answer for these needs in the industry sector and of course for the energy consumption in the household. Align some research, up to 2030, the energy consumption can rise about 60%. So at the same time, how we can answer for these needs, not to using the mix of these sources of energy. So at that moment, it is a huge challenge how to resign from coal and at the same time to deliver the energy needs that we have. Of course, when the huge aggression on Ukraine from Russia has started, we have to diversify and we have to build the different sources of energy. So the suppliers, the new suppliers of gas, and of course, we speed up our transition, our transformation into the new, especially the solar farm and the wind farm, especially in Poland. So now we are very proud that over 80% it is now the renewable sources of energy. But this is not the end, because we have a lot of industry, and maybe the mix that we want to implement and based on the nuclear power plant and especially the SMR, it will be the good mix how to answer for these needs. And it was the huge discussion, how to answer for needs for the heavy industry and for household, because we have the same grid, energy grid across Europe. And over the 40% of our grid is older than 40 years. So we have to modernize all this grid to answer for these needs and to be ready and to build a durable grid. Because in the other hand, we catch a blackout. It is obvious. So up to 2030, we have to spend over 400 billion euro only to modernize our energy grid. So if we are talking about the challenges that we have with the energy, we have to talk in the same time, parallelly, about the financial challenges that we have. Because without the public money and the private money, we'll not be able to answer for these needs. So 400 billion, it is only for the modernization of our grid. On the other hand, as a three-seas countries, as a three-seas region, I call this region from Estonia to Bulgaria, Greece. It is over 120 million population. And when we calculated before COVID crisis, before a war in Ukraine, how much money we have to spend to catch up the quality of our infrastructure, energy infrastructure, comparing to the western part of the European Union. And it is over 100 billion euro. So it is billions that we are talking about. At the same time, nothing stops. Can you imagine to switch off the energy across the world? Nobody can imagine this. How long, what is the oldest, not nuclear, I'm thinking about the nuclear plant, energy plant, the oldest, using the, not direct, but the alternative currents, the oldest in the world. Is anybody who can guess? 128 years, only. 128 years. It means that only 100 years depends us from energy forever. And this is the billions and the efforts that we have to do, because without the energy, we cannot live. And our responsibility, how we use the new sources of energy, how you find the new, more advanced financial structures to build this for our life, just for our life. So yes, we have challenge. There is a lot of challenges across the world. In Poland and in Europe, it is the same.
I want to ask one very specific follow-up question, because you're talking about deploying two very different types of electricity resources: renewables, variable renewables, much distributed, and then new nuclear power plants. Poland is looking to put nuclear power plants, working with a number of different companies. When you're thinking about the grid and building out the grid, and this is what this panel is about, you have two different outcomes for the grid if you're thinking about primarily renewables or doing much more on this base load and load following types of power plants. How do you think through your grid plans as you're right now in the process of developing the new energy resources?
In terms of grid, I think that maybe it is better to analyze how we should build the huge grid for the heavy industry and maybe separate for the household, because the renewable sources is more suitable for the household, not for the heavy industry. And from my perspective, for heavy industry, maybe the SMR it is the most suitable solution as an individual power plant for the heavy industry. Of course, I didn't mention about the hydrogen, because I fully believe that the hydrogen, it could be the fuel of the future with the different type of the technology that we can use. So
I want to come back to that.
Excellent.
Yeah, very good. We'll talk about that in the context of 3Cs as well. But let me go to Rebecca here. You're sitting in the UK. You're thinking about interconnections. You are both on an island, but have strong interconnections to mainland Europe, et cetera. So with IEA says we need to triple renewable capacity by 2050. As the UK is scaling up renewables, how are you thinking about transmission? How are you thinking about building up the transmission infrastructure to accelerate renewables deployment and also manage variability?
Okay, it's a great question, and particularly relevant for the UK, which has moved very, very fast with the deployment of offshore wind and has huge targets, legally binding targets to meet by 2030 and indeed 2050. I guess, speaking from National Grid, the responsibility that we have as the transmission owner and operator in the UK is multifaceted. You know, we have to connect new sources of generation. We have to ensure that the grid is resilient enough to transport it. We have to shift it often from where it's generated, which tends to be in the coastal north and east of the UK, to where it's consumed, which is very London-centric in the southeast in the UK. And also, as you quite rightfully said, we have to interconnect. So the UK is an island. Renewable generation, as we all know, is intermittent. There are not just hours, but days where wind doesn't blow. And batteries will not suffice that lull. At the moment, we make up for it with gas generation. I think we all had a very shocking experience in the last year of the risks and the economic turbulence that gas generation is attached to. So we are building out interconnectors to different European countries, and these are done through subsea HVDC cables that are attached to different converter stations on European shores and the UK shore. And they have proven to supplement a heavy renewable system really, really well across the UK. Of course, you don't just need the infrastructure to be built, you need the right regulatory frameworks, you need the right market signals to ensure the electrons go to where they're needed. But we hope to increase the interconnection build of the UK. And actually, we want to evolve from just having converter stations with a wire and another converter station to actually connecting offshore hybrid assets, to have offshore converters, to have offshore wind connected. So eventually this will evolve into a fully meshed grid across Europe.
I have two follow-up questions here. So first, Beata mentioned hydrogen. How are you thinking about hydrogen as a way of storing electricity and time shifting? that electricity from when it's produced to when the demand is. Second question, also related to time shifting. I think you have all seen Octopus Energy all over the place here at the COP. Obviously, they are on the distribution side, not on the transmission side. But how they have pretty significant penetration in the UK. How has their business of really of demand response and really changing and shifting demand, how is that impacting how you're thinking about transmission and time shifting of what you're providing?
So firstly on hydrogen, I mean, my belief is that hydrogen will be a complete game changer. I've worked in energy my entire career. I've come from a kind of energy system and energy economics modeling background. Hydrogen, when deployed at scale, and when from renewable sources, will be a complete game changer for the energy system because it will be a reliable source of long duration storage, something that is very, very difficult to deploy at scale right now. I think that the question is about when it becomes economically viable to deploy at scale. At the moment, we're just, doing a small number of projects across the UK, and indeed, we've still got a long way to go, I'd say, across the globe in improving, in deploying hydrogen. But it will come, absolutely, and we need to pursue that, particularly for heavy industry, actually, not just for managing storage. In terms of the role that Octopus and other challenger brands in the UK play with working with customers, we have to have consumers involved in the energy transition. It is the only way the transition will be affordable, first of all, and that we'll all change our habits. Octopus has been very successful in encouraging customer participation in demand-side response, which in the UK we've been terribly bad at bringing both industrial and domestic customers with us and participating in demand-side response, but it's so important in the future. And indeed, last winter there was a huge campaign about an energy switch-off to work with the system operator in the UK, so to kind of not just putting all the pressure on generators or indeed on the system operators to manage it all. We actually had the service in the UK triggered last week as well because it became exceptionally cold very suddenly. There was no wind and consumers play their part. So we're seeing this be more and more of a feature of a modern renewables-driven system.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, last but not least, I'm going to go to Miranda. So you're thinking about this very big picture. You're thinking about both developed countries, developing countries. How do you see the grid evolving, both in countries that have lots of electricity and a big electricity system, and then countries that really need more energy access? How do you see this, and what are you doing about it?
Great, thanks, Randy. And first of all, thank you to the Atlantic Council and to Denton's Global Advisors for including the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance in this conversation. CEBA represents about 400 companies, and the majority of our membership are large energy consumers. So often the voice of the energy customer is the one that's missing on stage. And it's a slightly different perspective. And maybe I'll start by almost summarizing what my esteemed colleagues have shared, that as large energy customers, think universities, cities, federal government agencies, and of course, corporations, commercial and industrial corporations that use a lot of energy. What we feel as energy customers is that the grid infrastructure, and I will primarily focus on the electrical grid, however, most of my comments are also quite transferable to thermal, to aviation fuel, to shipping, to all parts of the energy system. But what we feel is that grids in highly electrified markets and in less electrified markets are both woefully unprepared for the energy system of today. And I no longer say the energy system of the future because it is the energy system of today. And so I'm summarizing in some ways what my colleagues have said, but there are 4 distinct differences between today's grid infrastructure needs and the past. The first being the distance that electrons need to travel, both longer and shorter. dramatically shorter as we're moving carbon-free generated power from where it can be generated to where it's consumed, both longer and shorter. So the distance is dramatically different. Second, related to the first, is we now have a system of what we call prosumers of electricity, not just consumers of electricity. So particularly large energy customers are producing power on site and producing molecules on site, producing their own hydrogen on site or storing their own hydrogen on site. So the grid infrastructure needs to be able to manage production and consumption, where it used to only manage centralized production and decentralized consumption. Third is that the risks to today's grids, both in electrified and not yet electrified markets, are dramatically different than they have been in the past. Both the weather risks because of the changing climate weather patterns, but also the geopolitical risks, as no longer are we in a world where the only physical risk to the grid is somebody actually shooting at a substation or vandalizing a substation. We now have cyber attacks to grids that dramatically changes the way we think about how we need to be building grid infrastructure. And fourth, of course, the one that we mostly talk about is that the generation mix has changed quite a lot, where you no longer just have the 5 main sources, but you're now adding a lot of intermittent generation sources as well. So I'll start by sort of summarizing in that way from the energy customer perspective. Those are the 4 things we're seeing both in developed and less developed grid markets.
So what can energy customers do to help ensure that the grid is built out in a way that actually means that they have, as just an energy consumer and a business, have energy security? They can rely on the electricity to produce the goods that we all need.
So this is a massive shift that we have seen primarily in the United States and across the European markets, but we are seeing more and more engagement in less electrified markets around the world as well, where energy customers are now engaging in the conversation around how the grid is built in a way that we never have been before. Mm-hmm. The grid used to belong to governments and national grid, and energy customers said, you guys build it, we'll just be here to use, turn on the lights and plug into it. Now we are seeing large energy customers, and it's not just the big ones that you think about. It's not just the Googles and the Carrefours and the Walmarts and the Johnsons & Johnsons. It really is a much broader suite of energy customers engaging in the process with policymakers at all levels in what energy customers want to see in grid infrastructure build out, what they need to see, and importantly, what their demand for carbon-free power is going to be. What we have found as energy customers is that often in transmission and grid planning processes, the demands from customers are not being modeled in adequately. And so that is something that energy customers are asking for a lot more. We are no longer plugging into whatever you give us. We're plugging in with a demand for a certain kind of zero carbon, high reliability, high resilience, which is not the same as reliable, of course, and of course, affordable power.
And I want to add to that, which what I see with working with my clients, they also want it to happen faster. They want all of this built and they want it now. And so we've got to accelerate. Now, I see a lot of vigorous nodding coming from this side of the dais here. So, Deputy Minister Kamiden, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the customers are demanding, and then how you're thinking about it in Indonesia, where you're not just an island, you're islands, many islands. How do you think about this challenge in a country that has the geography of Indonesia?
Yeah, not that many people understand that Indonesia is a huge country and very complex. 17,500 islands, 3 time zones, 280 million people, GDP below 5,000, and electrification, electricity consumption per capita is only about 1,200 kilowatt hour. So this is a country that has a lot of headroom to grow. This is a country that is very difficult to interconnect, and this is a country that need power and development. So this is something that we need to balance all that, right? And I'm very grateful to hear what Miranda said. After even this JETP discussion and the planning, we recognize that we know the world is changing. We also want to do our part. And you are right. I think we need to hear much more about what consumer wants. But of course, this is a very, very challenging issue. And even today, we are still quite heavily dependent on fossil in our planning. And we plan to basically reduce more and more fossil. So I think just upon hearing this, I will probably need to talk to Helena and the colleagues. What else can we do? Can we learn more? Because in the end of the day, if you want to optimize something, then you need all the information. You need to be able to forecast the demand. And of course, Miranda, we cannot solve it right away. It's not like you just do this, right? It will require hundreds of billions of investment, even for Indonesia itself, actually. I don't know the answer to your question yet, but I know the process that I need to do. We'll need to keep improving our planning system and maybe not finding the perfect solution today, but find all those no regrets moves and perfectly acceptable solution one by one and keep improving and keep learning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to go to Rebecca because the themes that Miranda brought up are very, very applicable to you. How do you think about these consumers when they are having all of these demands and they want them now? And interconnections in the UK new interconnections of new energy assets take how long?
Yes.
Better than the US, I know. It's better than the US.
It's better than US, I guess. It's quite well published in the UK, and actually it's a common theme across Europe about the length of time it takes from the initial application to put a new asset on the grid and then actually going through consenting and finally getting hooked up. The UK government has realised that this is a major blocker to a decarbonised energy system. It's just absolutely, dissatisfactory to all parties involved. And what we're working on is firstly planning, which you mentioned, and the importance of this, of having not just a centralized plan for the grid, but also a strategic spatial plan. It's because different localities need to be treated different communities need to be treated differently. But we are also changing the obligations of the regulator. So energy regulation in the UK has been really focused on economics. It's economic regulation. And we've just had a new energy bill passed in the UK, which has actually given a statutory duty to the energy regulator to consider net zero obligations, so decarbonisation as well as consumer welfare. Of course, consumer welfare is incredibly important, but you have to balance this with the longer term view of what we're trying to achieve with decarbonisation. Equally, there's much tougher rules coming in on the kind of projects that are in the queue, because I can't remember the figures off the top of my head. It's something ridiculous, like 10 or 20 amounts of capacity that the UK would ever need, even in 2050, is in the current connections queue. So many projects are no more than like a prop shop with a brand, right?
Yep.
And they should not be treated in the same way with meaningful projects where people are investing development expenditure, they're consulting through the planning process already. There has to be a differentiation, and so we're going to see harsher treatments of those kind of skeleton projects in the future.
Fascinating. That's an issue that's not often raised, but I think a valuable one. In the last 10 minutes, I want to pivot a little bit and think about, we've been talking at the national level primarily about a lot of these issues, but how we can think about interconnection between countries. And so the 3Cs initiative is a really interesting one. So maybe we could first start with Beata about how the 3Cs initiative is thinking about energy interconnection and specifically electricity. And then I want to go to Helena to talk about how you're thinking about electricity interconnection in many parts of the world.
Yeah, in the 3Cs initiative, this is initiative inspired by our presidents and focusing on the three main sectors. It is logistics and transportation, energy, and digital infrastructure. In terms of energy infrastructure, there is a huge challenge that I mentioned, that we have to fulfill the gaps between the eastern part of Europe and the western part of Europe. At the same time, we have to fulfill the quality and the transformation that we have to implement parallelly with this increasing the quality of this infrastructure. So in terms of the figures, we have to spend over 1 billion euro just to increase the quality of our infrastructure. In terms of diversification of our sources of energy, we want to invest in the hydrogen system. And we have, for instance, even in Poland, we have 11 hydrogen walleys. So it means that in this region, we want to stem on hydrogen sources because, for instance, Poland, it is the third, the biggest producer of hydrogen. Of course, it is gray. It is gray hydrogen, third in Europe and the fifth in the whole world. So it is huge potential how to use this hydrogen as a very stable source of energy. And if we are thinking about the energy and the cooperation between the countries and the axis north-south, we are building the pipe, and of course how to transform the gas pipe into double use for also the hydrogen pipe. And of course the 5 corridors that we plan to implement in Europe, which allow to fulfill these gaps in terms of energy consumption through the hydrogen grid and the hydrogen pipes. It is estimated that it should take 7 years to fulfill this, all the pipelines projects that we have to build the stable pipe for hydrogen for our region. So I strongly believe it will be the turning point for our region and for entire Europe, how to turn and how to change the sources of energy from gas, from coal, into the new and renewable energy and the zero CO2 production. So this is our aim, and only the common effort, especially if we are thinking about the streets region countries. As I mentioned, it is a 120 million population, but we have a lot of very small countries. As Estonia, it is 1.5 million population. These countries needs a lot of help because only common power of our countries, common understanding of these needs gives us the possibility to answer for this huge energy transformation that we have to implement.
Thank you. Helena?
So I think there's a couple different elements of how we're looking at really the geopolitics of the energy transition and the role that electrification could play. And maybe I'll cover 2 and see if we have time for another. So in the work that we're doing right now, obviously we're operating, all of us, in a really exciting but also complicated time. So while there's incredible momentum to move forward the energy transition, the work we're doing in our own economy and around the world, we're also dealing, especially in the case of Europe, with a war that is creating and affecting energy prices. Part of what that does, in addition to all the things that you laid out, including finding new partners for natural gas and trying to boost and move green hydrogen faster, does create different opportunities for electrification that maybe wouldn't have been as cost effective before. And so we see opportunities we were looking at for a long time, whether it's the Eurasia interconnector, opportunities to actually generate renewable energy in the Eastern Med and find ways that we can commercially move that into the European grid. And so while these are large-scale projects, we on our team with PGI have thought, how do we do that at an even larger, more supportive scale? So one of the projects that we announced just in September at the G20 is called IMEC, and it's essentially a large interconnection project, rail, green hydrogen pipeline, and electricity from India through the Middle East to Europe. And now this will take a long time to bring together, but it's an opportunity to, one, take advantage of an opportunity to generate electricity, clean electricity at a much more cost-effective rate, leverage some existing infrastructure while investing in some new infrastructure. But it also allows us to take advantage of the benefits of connectivity, meaning we are working together across economies, across countries, through an economic purpose, through a purpose that actually provides one of the most necessary things you need for economic growth, which is energy. And so always has been kind of the tenet of how we look at this type of work. I think that the other way that we're looking at this on my team as well is through the clean energy supply chain itself. So as we're thinking through ways that we can diversify opportunities around the world for solar manufacturing, solar panel development, which is something that's super important to a lot of our partners, whether it's India or some of the exciting things that are happening in Morocco, we're also thinking about what we need to actually enable the transition. Transmission lines need a lot of copper. Cleaner energy systems, no matter how great we get the grid, will need some sort of battery support, right? So we have to think about it as an ecosystem, how we're investing from soup to nuts, from the materials that go into our capabilities to create clean energy to the actual deployment, and then how we bring it all together.
Thank you so much. So we're almost out of time. I want to do a rapid fire, 30 seconds each, down the row, a closing statement. So final thoughts, starting with Rebecca, moving this way.
I think you've already heard it. There's no energy transition without transmission. So planning, investment in grids is absolutely essential.
That's a catchphrase. No energy transition without transmission. I'm going to remember that.
So want to continue, Helena. Indonesia has a lot of critical minerals required and will be open for business. We want to help the world power, transmission, and for us with the storage.
Thank you.
Just a reminder that the energy customer plays a big role, and if you're planning the transmission system, include energy customers in your planning processes.
That we need to get creative in how we think through different ways that we actually finance transmission, especially when we have renewable capacity already built, and bringing our financial institutions along with us will be a big piece of that puzzle that I didn't have a chance to get to in my regular remarks.
I believe the future will be the nuclear fusion, and it will be easier energy for everybody and very clean. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Fantastic panel. Please give everybody a round of applause. I want to thank the audience here, thank everyone who's watching online, and please check out the Atlantic Council website, atlanticcouncil.org, for future events here at the Global Decarbonization Accelerator. And everyone enjoy your time here in Dubai at COP28. Thank you all so much.